All right, here we go. So a little extension to the circulatory system section I thought we'd do is to make a map of the four-chambered heart, and also to do a little dissection of a four-chambered heart. So I have a pig's heart, actually, and these are not the fetal pigs that you were going to dissect, but these are full-size pigs that have been slaughtered for meat. And I literally go to the meat market to buy them. And so this will be a full-size pig heart that's probably almost the size of a human heart, actually. So it'll give us real good detail of the size of the chambers and the valves and all that. And that'll be hopefully fun to watch. But this is going to be important too, because this is going to be something I'm going to want you to reproduce on the test. So pay attention, because you're going to have to reproduce this drawing yourself in your own unique way. But here we go. So we're going to start with just kind of a crude diagram of the heart, kind of like the most typical way you would see the heart drawn. Now, this is not perfectly anatomically correct, obviously, but that's how we're going to draw this to make this easy to learn, because this set can be kind of difficult to learn and memorize. And so hopefully after we're done with this, you have an easy way to remember these terms the rest of your life. I don't know if some of you are going to be heart surgeons or not, but you will definitely take more advanced biology where you're A&P, and you'll have to know these things. And so you can kind of get lost in the mess of the map. So again, this is a map of a four-chambered heart. And what we're going to concern ourselves with is the chambers, obviously. We're going to also label the valves. And we're going to look at the vessels. And just in general, be interested in the flow. So we're looking at the chambers, the valves, the vessels, and the flow of blood through the heart. Now, when you're looking at the heart, there's a left side and a right side, and it has to do with the organism that the heart is sitting in. So if you're doing let's say a heart surgery, and you're looking down at the heart, then wouldn't you agree that this would be the left side of that heart for that person? That's where their left hand would be. That's where the left side of their body is. The right side of the heart would be over here, just the opposite. All right? Now, in fact, that's even separated by something called a septum. It's called a septum. It's a kind of a thick structure here that separates the left side of the heart and the right side of the heart. It's called a septum, S-E-P-T-U-M. All right? Now, there's four chambers, so we have atriums and ventricles, and we'll write all that down in a legend here in just a second. But first of all, let's put a line here that separates the atriums and the ventricles so that we have our four chambers. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 chambers. Now, it's important to remember this, because these are going to be true statements all the way through this. These are going to be true statements, and here's where people will make a lot of mistakes, is they'll throw terms around that don't necessarily apply to what they're talking about. They'll call all arteries veins, or they'll call veins arteries when they should not. Okay, so an atrium always receives blood into the heart. So blood always goes into an atrium. Sorry, I'm pointing over the atriums are up at the top here, by the way. So, but into. So I'm making my fingers go in so that you can see that you're going in. Now, a way to remember that is when you walk into a building, usually if it's a fancy building, you're going to walk into an atrium. So I wish I had screen mirroring, or I had a way to show you that right now in the video, but I don't. I guess I could look for a magazine, but if any of you have ever looked in architecture magazines, probably not, but you've seen pictures of buildings where they just kind of want to show the front entryway or whatever like that. They're just trying to advertise the building. You'll see usually there's like a picture of like an atrium, and basically an atrium is like the entryway to a building, but there's something more specific when it comes to architecture as far as what an atrium is, and it has to do with, like, if it's like a 7-story building, when you walk into the atrium goes all the way up. There's no levels to the atrium. It's basically just like an open an open space. An atrium refers to literally the open space that goes all the way up to the ceiling, usually, up to like some skylights or something like that. And it just makes the building more appealing. And in fact, usually they're at the entrance of a building, because when you walk into a building, it's kind of nice to be able to see where all the floors are. Usually hotels and skyscrapers will have somewhat of an atrium. Sometimes they don't go all the way to the top, but there'll be some atrium that really allows you to kind of see where you're at before you start going up elevators and stairs and things like that and getting lost. So atriums just are like big columns of just air, big columns of air, and they're usually in the entryway. They don't have to be, but since they usually are in the entryway, that's how I always remember that an atrium is where blood enters the heart. So atriums are always receiving blood because that's where blood goes into the heart. Now ventricles, I don't really have a fancy way of remembering this, except that it's the opposite of an atrium. This is where blood gets pumped out of the heart. So blood pumps out of the heart. Blood's always leaving the heart through a ventricle. All right? Now, we also have arteries and veins, which kind of use the same terminology and the same kind of system here. And that is that veins always bring blood back to the heart. So veins are always, well, all vessels go to the heart. That's where, again, you have to be careful. You have to be careful about what you call an artery and what you call a vein, because technically these vessels go to the heart. They connect to the heart. But veins are bringing blood, as far as the flow, they're bringing blood back to the heart. And arteries are carrying blood away from the heart. So we'll put away from the heart. Okay? Away from the heart. And so we're going to couple those terms, arteries and veins, with other terms too. So we have to just remember that these are always true. Arteries leave the heart, veins come back to the heart. Atriums are chambers that receive blood, they're up top here, and ventricles are chambers that pump blood out. We're going to make our map here in just a second. And when we make our map, we're going to use colors to illustrate something. So deoxygenated blood, that is blood that does not have oxygen, we'll use the color blue. Oxygenated blood, which is blood that obviously has oxygen, we'll use the color red. Okay? And the valves we'll draw at the very end. Okay? So to begin with, you can actually kind of begin anywhere, but we'll just pick a starting spot that I think is a good place to start. Actually, before we even do that, let's label our chambers. And I'm just going to make this simple to fit and easy to fit, so I'm going to abbreviate. This is the left side of the heart. This is an atrium, so I'm going to put LA for left atrium. This is the left side of the heart, and this is the ventricle, so I'm going to put LV for left ventricle. I'm going to do the same for the right side of the heart. I'm going to label my right atrium, and I'm going to label my right ventricle. Okay? So we have our chambers. Now let's draw the vessels. And again, I'm going to pick a spot in the circle that I'm going to call the beginning, just like 12 o'clock is a convenient spot on the clock to start the time or whatever. I'm going to pick where blood is deoxygenated and nothing's really been done to it. Okay, so that's where I'm going to start. And that would be right here in the right ventricle. So in the right ventricle, we're going to pump blood out that is deoxygenated, so I'm going to use the color blue. It's deoxygenated, so I'm going to use the color blue. And we're going to go to the lungs because we need to pick up some oxygen. All right, so this is deoxygenated blood, and we're going to the lungs to pick up some oxygen. So I'll draw some lungs here. Draw a trachea with bronchial tubes and the rings of cartilage that keep that open. Okay, that's where the air goes, and then the air goes into these lungs where there's multiple branching going on. All right, and then at the alveoli sacs, where the capillaries are, you'll get the gas exchange, okay? And then you'll pick up your oxygen, and then you'll go from there. You'll pick up your oxygen, and you'll leave the lungs and go back to the heart. But this time, I'm going to go just behind the heart here, and I'm going to come up and in like this. And I'm going to enter the atrium like that. Okay, so before I get too far, let me back up a little bit. Now, let's go back to where we started. We left the heart. So what kind of vessels leave the heart? Arteries. And we're going to the lungs. Now, something to remember real quick is that lungs, we use a term called pulmonary. Pulmonary refers to lungs. And so since we're going to the lungs and we're leaving the heart, we're going to do that via a pulmonary artery. Okay, so it's going to be a pulmonary artery that leaves the heart and goes to the lungs. And again, that blood is deoxygenated. Once it gets to the lungs, it can be oxygenated. And then we can use another vessel to carry it back to the heart. And that vessel, since it's going back to the heart, is going to be a vein. And so now this one is going to be a pulmonary, I'm just going to abbreviate, pulmonary vein. A vein because it's going back to the heart. But this time it's oxygenated blood. It's ready to go. It's ready to be pumped to all the other organs and tissues in your body. Remember, every cell in your body needs oxygen. So we've got to enter the heart in an atrium. Okay, so you're going to enter the atrium, but then you have to get from the atrium to the ventricle before you leave the heart to go to the rest of the body. And so you'll do that. And there's a little valve there, which we'll draw at the end. There's a valve that takes us from the atrium to the ventricle, but doesn't allow us to go back to the atrium because you don't want blood going the opposite way. And the way the heart squeezes and relaxes, blood would get sucked back in if you didn't have that one-way valve. It's like a check valve. It allows blood to only go one direction. And during the dissection, I'll show you how that works. It's really, really cool. Okay, so now we've got to leave the heart with good oxygenated blood and go to different parts of the body. And that basically is everywhere. Again, every cell in your body needs oxygen. So this is actually called the aorta. Aorta. You have a ascending aorta and a descending aorta. And then they branch and branch and branch and branch. There's branching off of this, and then those will branch, and then those will branch, and those will branch till eventually you end up to, capillaries, which are very, very thin-walled vessels. Very thin-walled so that gas exchange can occur. And those are going to be at all your organ systems. So there'll be your aorta. It's going to branch and branch and branch to eventually capillaries, and those will be at your hands, feet, your brain, your liver, stomach, liver, kidney, etc. You name it. Every cell in your body, every cell needs oxygen. Remember cellular respiration? To make ATP, every cell needs to make ATP, and it needs oxygen to do that, and glucose. And so the circulatory system with blood is moving around oxygen. But remember, the cell or the heart is also pumping blood that carries sugar and all kinds of other vital elements, compounds and minerals and things like that. So the circulatory system is not just for oxygen and carbon dioxide, but that's kind of one of the main reasons that we want to move liquid around our body. Okay, so after our hands, feet, brain, liver, etc., you name it, after those cells use up the oxygen, it's going to be deoxygenated blood again. And then it's got to go back to the heart so that it can pick up blood. Now, or pick up oxygen. Now, why wouldn't it want to go straight to the lungs? Why can't we just send the blood now to the lungs? Well, that's actually not very efficient. It's actually better to go to the heart first, then get pumped to the lungs, then get brought back. And you'll see when we're done with this whole map that actually you're always supplying every pump of the heart, you're supplying fresh oxygenated blood. Whereas the other way around, you'd have to wait for it to go here and then go to the systems. Okay, so these are called, we'll just call this systems. Systems. And so another thing you could call this vessel here is a systemic artery. Systemic artery. Artery because it's leaving the heart, and systemic because it's going to your different systems. So these are going to be systemic arteries. And then you're going to have a systemic vein that's going to go back to the heart. Now, I'm going to have to go up and around here again. This is what I'll do. I'll go like this. I'll go behind the heart again, and then come around like that. And then I'll go, let's see, that. Right? I don't like the way that looks. But this is a vein, right? Because it's going back to the heart. And it's systemic because it's coming from the systems. So these are going to be systemic veins, which are also called vena cava. At least it is whenever it's like large. So by the time it gets here, you have a superior vena cava and an inferior vena cava, really large vessel. But there's lots of multiple systemic veins that come into the main systemic vein, right? The point is, systemic means it comes from the systems. Vein means it's going back to the heart. And if we're going back to the heart, remember, we have to enter an atrium. And so we enter the right atrium. Well, now we're ready to go. Now that's deoxygenated blood that needs to be reoxygenated. So we'll just come through the right ventricle so that we can get pumped to the lungs, come back to the heart, to the left atrium, and we can go out the left ventricle to the tissues again. Then we come back to the heart, to the right atrium where we come in, and then get pumped to the right ventricle. Like again, you actually get pumped from the right atrium to the ventricle. So blood actually, these little atriums, they're made of muscles. The whole heart is a muscle, but it flexes in a very like fluid way. And at some point, if you were to freeze frame it, you would see that the right atrium is pumping blood just independently. It's pumping blood into the right ventricle. All right, so let's draw our valves now. When the right atrium pumps blood into the right ventricle, you have a 3-valve system there called a tricuspid. Tri means 3, and this is a cuspid. You'll see what the cuspids are when we do the dissection. So there's a tricuspid valve. Again, that allows blood to flow into the ventricle but not back into the atrium. Because the way the muscle works, when it squeezes and then goes back to its original shape, just like you would squeeze a bottle underwater and then let it come back to its shape, it's going to want to pull water in or whatever. There's multiple experiments where you could do that, but it has to do with pressure. And the pressure is always going to want to go from a greater pressure to a lower pressure. And so when you have a low pressure would be in the atrium. As it expands again, you're going to have a low pressure there. Well, the greater pressure in here is going to want to pump blood right back in, but you don't want that. So this is a one-way valve, and it's really interesting how it works. But you're also going to need a valve here, okay? Because when the right ventricle squeezes, it's going to want to relax and go back to its original shape. And so when it does that, it's going to have a tendency to want to pull blood back into the ventricle, but you don't want that. You want it only going out. And so you have what's called a semilunar valve here. The semilunar valve. And so what that semilunar means is that lunar would be like the lunar is kind of like a circle, and so or moon shape, right? And so semilunar means like almost a moon. So it kind of looks like this. Kind of looks like a parachute. In fact, that's what I think they look like, is parachutes, because you'll see there's actually little cords that connect to that, and it's very flexible like a parachute would be. But those are called semilunar valves. There's also another set of semilunar valves here on the left ventricle. Coming out of the left ventricle, you'll also have another set of semilunar valves. All right? Now, when when we come back to the heart from the lungs and we enter the left atrium, you don't need a valve here. In fact, you don't even need a valve there in the right atrium. The atriums don't really need valves because you don't really have that kind of pressure situation going on there. There's always an incoming pressure. There's always high pressure. So blood's always being forced in no matter what. So we don't have to worry about blood accidentally wanting to come back out in any way. But to go from the atrium here to this ventricle, from the left atrium to the left ventricle, you have the same situation you do over here, but this time it's just going to be a bicuspid valve. Only two little valves are there. And so basically the way they work is blood can pass through the valve, but then when the blood is not moving, it goes like that. It's like a trap door. It's a trap door, but it won't keep going that way because they bump into each other, and so they stop. It can go like that, no problem. So blood can come in this way all day, but if blood tries to go this way, the valves shut and they stay shut. Okay, there's only two little trap doors that meet on the bicuspid valve, whereas on the tricuspid valve, you have like 3 little doors. You have like, I don't know how to show that with my fingers, but you have 3 little doors that will open and then come back and shut. They'll open and they'll come back and lock together. So that, remember, you don't want blood coming up into the atriums, you only want it leaving. So there's like one-way valves. These also are the same way. They work the same, or they work on the same goal of only allowing blood to flow one way, but they do operate on somewhat of a different principle, and at least the way they're like shaped or whatever. So these are like cusps. I'll show you what they look like. They're like cusps, and these are like semi-lunar, like parachute valves. So do you get the flow here? This is a kind of a complicating map here, but hopefully if you get these terms down, you'll always be able to answer a question where because there will be questions on the test where I say, is blood oxygenated or deoxygenated in the pulmonary artery? Well, you might jump the gun and say, oh, it's an artery, so it's leaving the heart. And if it's leaving the heart, it's going to be oxygenated. But that's not true. And in fact, most of them are, because they're going to all your systems. But the one and only pulmonary artery that is deoxygenated is this pulmonary artery. The only artery that is deoxygenated is the pulmonary artery, because it's taking blood away from the heart to go to the lungs to pick up oxygen. After it does that, again, there's little capillaries here too in the alveoli sacs, really, really thin-walled vessels that are going to allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to move whatever direction they need to move, right? And then once we've picked up oxygen, we can come back to the heart and the atrium, then go to the ventricle, be pumped out to our organs, come back to the heart deoxygenated, but no problem because we can enter the heart and then leave the heart again to go get oxygen. Okay? Now, notice here you have a vein that is carrying oxygenated blood. Most veins don't carry oxygen because most veins are coming from organs that have used up the oxygen. So most veins we think of as blue because they're deoxygenated. But here is a vein that is red and it's oxygenated. And that throws a lot of people off because they think veins are usually deoxygenated. But there's one vein, the pulmonary vein, that because it's bringing blood back to the heart, we have to call it a vein. Veins come back to the heart, arteries go away from the heart, atriums receive blood, ventricles pump blood out. Again, you have oxygenated and deoxygenated through the colors here. So there you go. There's a very simple, crude map for you. Here's some other images that I might have looked a little cleaner if we used some of these, but then you kind of get lost in the map. There's this one. You'll see lots of these. There's many different ones out there. But if you draw a simple diagram like this, like the heart, like you would normally draw it when you write I love you on a card or something like that for Mother's Day, it's real easy to figure out what's left and what's right, and the tops and bottoms you can easily separate those little lines like that. Okay, so now let's get into the dissection.